What does it feel like to live in a world of genuine beauty and genuine progress, and to have no idea that it is about to end? In the decades between the late 19th century and the summer of 1914, Europe produced some of the most extraordinary art, architecture, and cultural life in its history, while simultaneously accumulating the rivalries, the arms, and the entanglements that would tear it apart. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hotsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
The Belle Epoque is one of those periods that is easier to understand in retrospect than it was to live through, because the retrospective view reveals the tension that the people living in it could not fully see, between the brilliance of what was being built and the fragility of the conditions that made it possible. Tonight, we turn to an era that believed in its own permanence and discovered, in the space of a few weeks, in the summer of 1914. The question is not simply what was beautiful about the Belle Epoque, but what the beauty was resting on, and what it was concealing.
The Belle Epoque, the beautiful era, is the name that Europeans later gave to the period roughly between 1880 and 1914. The name was applied retrospectively after the catastrophe that ended it. The people living through it did not call it that. They were simply living in what seemed, to those who could afford to notice, like an era of unprecedented possibility.
We are speaking about the Belle Epoque, the period of apparent prosperity and cultural brilliance in Europe that preceded the First World War, and about the forces that made both the brilliance and the catastrophe possible.
The era produced Impressionism and Art Nouveau, electric lighting and early cinema, the Eiffel Tower, and the Paris Metro. It also produced the alliance systems, the colonial rivalries, the arms races, and the nationalism that would consume a generation. Both things were true simultaneously, and understanding the era requires holding both in view.
Then let us begin with what the era looked like from inside, and with who could see it that way.
Paris was the symbolic center of the Belle Epoque. Those similar currents ran through Vienna, Berlin, London, and the European capitals. The city had been reconstructed by Baron Haussmann in the second half of the 19th century, its medieval streets replaced by wide boulevards, parks, and monuments designed to project imperial grandeur and facilitate both commerce and social control. By the 1880s and 90s, it was the most visited and most admired city in the world. The introduction of electric lighting transformed urban life in ways that are difficult to overstate. Cities that had been dark after sunset were suddenly illuminated. Department stores, theaters, cafes, and the new cabarets of Montmartre glowed through the night. The distinction between day and night as organizing principles of social life began to dissolve for those who could afford to participate in the illuminated world. The Paris of the Belle Epoque was a city that had extended its hours.
So electric light was not only a technology, but a reshaping of when social life was possible.
Yes, and here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard image of the Belle Epoque. The cafes, the cabaret, the world exhibitions, the fashionable boulevards. These were the experience of a minority. The working-class population of Paris, which constituted the majority of the city's residents, lived in very different conditions. Industrial labor, overcrowded housing, low wages, and the constant proximity of economic precarity were the material reality for most Parisians. The city's brilliance was built on and funded by that labor. The artistic movements of the era were responses to the transformations of modernity, often ambivalent ones. The Impressionists, painting in the 1870s and 80s, turned their attention to the surfaces of modern life, the light on water, the movement of crowds, the leisure of the bourgeoisie in parks and cafes. They were painting a world that was changing faster than any previous generation had experienced, and their technique, which captured impression rather than fixed form, was partly a response to that instability.
So, the art of the era was not simply celebrating modernity, but trying to find a visual language adequate to its pace and its uncertainty.
Yes, Art Nouveau, which flourished through the 1890s and the first decade of the 20th century, took a different approach. Its sinuous organic forms, its integration of decorative and structural elements, and its application to architecture, furniture, poster design, and everyday objects represented an attempt to bring beauty into the fair texture of daily life. The Paris Metro entrances, designed by Hector Guimard, with their green iron stems and amberglass canopies, are its most immediately recognizable survivors. The world exhibitions that punctuated the Belle Epoque were deliberately staged demonstrations of European and American technological and imperial confidence. The Paris Exhibition of 1889, at which the Eiffel Tower was erected as a temporary structure, attracted over 32 million visitors. The Exposition Universelle of 1900 attracted 50 million. These were not simply trade fairs. They were theatrical productions in which the participating nations presented their achievements, their colonial possessions, and their visions of a progressive future to mass audiences.
The exhibitions were performances as much as celebrations of progress.
Yes, and the colonial dimension of that power was not incidental. European empires at the turn of the 20th century controlled the vast majority of Africa, much of Asia, and large portions of the Americas. The wealth that funded the cafés, the exhibitions, the boulevards, and the cultural life of the Belle Epoque was extracted in significant part from colonial territories through systems of labor exploitation, resource extraction, and political coercion that the exhibitions sometimes literally put on display, presenting colonized peoples as exhibits. The political structure of Europe in the Belle Epoque was organized around a system of alliances and counter-alliances that had developed in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. Germany's defeat of France and unification under Prussian leadership had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. France sought alliances to contain German power. Germany sought alliances to prevent encirclement. Britain maintained its traditional policy of balancing continental powers while protecting its naval supremacy. Each major power was simultaneously seeking security and accumulating the commitments that would make a local crisis into a continental catastrophe.
So the alliance system that was meant to provide stability was also creating the mechanism by which a single incident could trigger a general war.
Precisely. And this is the turning point in understanding the Belle Epoque. The peace that prevailed in Western Europe between 1871 and 1914 was real, but it was not unconditional. It was sustained by a balance of deterrence that depended on the major powers being unwilling to risk a general war. What changed in 1914 was not the existence of the tensions which had been building for decades, but the willingness of key decision-makers to risk that general war rather than accept diplomatic humiliation. The arms race between Britain and Germany, centered on naval construction, was one of the most visible expressions of the underlying tension. Germany's decision to build a large ocean-going navy was perceived in Britain as a direct challenge to the naval supremacy on which British imperial power depended. The Anglo-German naval rivalry drove significant increases in military spending by both countries and contributed to the hardening of the alliance blocs. By 1914, Europe's major powers had military plans that required rapid mobilization and left limited time for diplomatic resolution once the process began. The growth of nationalist movements across Europe was another structural pressure building beneath the surface elegance of the era. In the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which contained a dozen major ethnic groups with varying degrees of political aspiration, nationalism was a constant source of internal tension and external pressure. The Balkans, where Ottoman withdrawal had left competing claims and small new states with great power patrons, were the region where the tensions were most acute and the stability most precarious.
So the elegance of Paris in 1900 and the political crisis in Sarajevo in 1914 were products of the same European system.
Yes, and the people who attended the Paris exhibition of 1900 and the people who made the decisions in the summer of 1914 were often the same people. The world of the Belle Epoque was not destroyed by outside forces. It destroyed itself, using the mechanisms it had built, in pursuit of interests it had always had. The catastrophe was not an accident that happened to a peaceful world. It was the product of a world that was peaceful on its surface and militarized beneath it. Early cinema was one of the defining new technologies of the Belle Epoque, and one of the most vivid examples of how the era experienced modernity. The Lumiere brothers gave their first public film screening in Paris in December 1895. Within a year, cinemas were operating in dozens of cities across Europe and North America. The experience of seeing moving images of real life, of trains arriving at stations and workers leaving factories, was genuinely unprecedented. For the first audiences, the moving image was not a storytelling medium. It was a demonstration that reality itself could be captured and replayed.
So early cinema was experienced as a technology of reality, not primarily as entertainment.
Yes, and this relationship between new technology and a transformed experience of reality is characteristic of the Belle Epoque more broadly. The telephone, the automobile, the airplane, the wireless telegraph, X-ray image, all of these emerged or became practically significant in the decades between 18 and 1914. Each of them altered the experience of space, time, the body, or communication in ways that required entirely new frameworks of understanding. The Belle Epoque was not simply a period of technological progress. It was a period in which the pace of change began to exceed the pace at which people could adjust their sense of what was normal. The social question was one of the defining political tensions of the era. The industrial working class had grown enormously through the second half of the 19th century, and socialist, anarchist, and labor movements were pressing for political representation, improved conditions, and in some cases the transformation of the entire social order. The anxiety among European elites about social revolution was real and constant. The suppression of the Paris Commune in 1871, in which the French government's military killed between 10,000 and 30,000 people, remained within living memory for much of the Belle Epoque.
So the elegance of the boulevards was partly sustained by the knowledge of what had happened the last time the social order was challenged.
Yes, the peace conferences at The Hague in 1899 and 7 represented attempts to establish international legal frameworks for the conduct of war and the resolution of disputes. They produced conventions on the laws of war, and established the permanent court of arbitration. But they also revealed the limits of what the major powers were willing to accept in terms of constraints on their sovereignty, and their ability to use force. The peace movement of the Belle Epoque was genuine. So was the arms race that proceeded in parallel with it. The role of women in the Belle Epoque is a dimension of the era that its popular image frequently underrepresents. The period saw significant and contested changes in women's public roles. In France, women were gaining access to higher education and the professions in increasing numbers. The suffrage movement was active and increasingly organized across Europe and North America. Marie Curie won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1903 and in Chemistry in 1911. The image of the elegant Parisian woman at the cabaret coexisted with the image of the woman scientist, the labor organizer, and the suffragette.
So the Belle Epoque was also a period of contest over who was included in its brilliance.
Yes, and this contest between those who benefited from the era's prosperity and those who were excluded from it or exploited to produce it was one of the structural tensions that made the era as unstable as it was. The social movements of the Belle Epoque, whether labor, feminist, nationalist, or colonial resistance movements, were not marginal footnotes to a story of progress. They were responses to the same conditions that produced the progress, and they shaped what came after it as much as the alliance systems and the arms race did.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand the world of the Belle Epoque in its full complexity, the elegance and the instability together, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Proud Tower by Barbara Tuchman.
So this is a book that captures the social and political atmosphere of the period without reducing it to either a celebration or a prologue to disaster.
Tuchman explores the world between 1890 and 1914 through vivid narratives, revealing both the glamour and the instability of the period. The book shows how a seemingly confident and prosperous Europe stood unknowingly on the brink of one of the most devastating conflicts in history, presenting the era through the lives and decisions of real people rather than through abstract structural analysis.
Is it accessible to readers without prior knowledge of the period?
Tuchman is one of the great narrative historians of the 20th century. The Proud Tower reads more like a series of connected portraits than a conventional history. Each chapter focused on a different aspect of the era, from the British aristocracy to the anarchist movement to the peace conferences that tried and failed to reduce the risk of general war. No prior knowledge is required. The book builds its own context as it goes.
So it gives the reader the texture of the era, the feeling of being inside a world that does not yet know what is coming.
Precisely, and that quality of not yet knowing is what makes it essential reading for understanding the Belle Epoque. Tuchman renders the contingency of the period, the sense that things might have gone differently, more vividly than almost any other account.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of the Belle Epoque was shaped by the catastrophe that ended it. The First World War killed approximately 17 million people, destroyed 4 empires, and reshaped the political map of Europe and the Middle East. The world that emerged from the war in 1918 bore almost no resemblance to the world of 1900. The confidence, the elegance, and above all the sense of indefinite progress that had characterized the Belle Epoque had been consumed. The term Belle Epoque itself is a product of that loss. It was coined after the war by people looking back at what had existed before, giving it a name that expressed both its beauty and the fact that it was gone. There is melancholy built into the name itself. It says, that was the beautiful era, and it is finished, and we are the people who came after it.
So the name was invented by people who could see what the people living in it could not.
Yes, and this retrospective quality is central to how we understand the period. The historians and writers of the 1920s who looked back at the pre-war world found in it both a genuine achievement and a terrible innocence. The innocence of people who believed that the progress of free civilization made catastrophic war unthinkable. The economist Norman Angell had argued in 1910 that the economic interdependence of European nations made major war economically irrational and therefore unlikely. He was right about the irrationality. He was wrong about what that implied. The cultural legacy of the Belle Epoque endured even after the political order that produced it had been destroyed. Art Nouveau, Impressionism, and the early modernism that emerged in the first decade of the 20th century continued to shape visual culture throughout the 20th century. The Moulin Rouge still operates in Paris. The metro entrances designed by Guimard still stand. The paintings of Monet and Renoir fill the world's great museums. The aesthetic culture of the era survived the catastrophe that ended it, which is one reason it retains such persistent appeal.
So the art outlived the world that produced it.
Yes, and there is something in that survival that is itself worth examining. The art of the Belle Epoque captured something true about the experience of modernity, about the beauty and anxiety of living in a world changing faster than it could be understood, that remained true after the specific social conditions that produced the art had been destroyed. The Impressionist painting of light on water does not require the Third Republic or the Paris Bourse to remain moving. It requires only a viewer who has experienced the feeling of trying to hold something beautiful that is already passing. The modern relevance of the Belle Epoque is perhaps clearest as a warning about the relationship between surface prosperity and structural fragility. The early 21st century has been compared to the pre-war era on multiple occasions, with observers noting the combination of technological optimism, economic inequality, rising nationalism, great power, competition, and the increasing obsolescence of the international institutions designed to manage conflict. Whether the comparison is apt in its implications is a question that history has not yet answered. That it keeps being raised is itself significant.
The Belle Epoque is not only a historical period, it is a recurring cautionary structure.
Yes, and the caution it offers is specific. Prosperity is not the same as stability. The belief that things cannot get catastrophically worse because they are currently very good is not a protection. It is an additional vulnerability, because it prevents the serious attention to structural problems that might otherwise produce correction before correction becomes impossible. The people who attended the Exposition Universelle of 1900 in Paris, who watched the moving images in the new cinemas, and rode the new metro under the illuminated boulevards, were not foolish people who ignored obvious signs. The signs were there, but they were embedded in a system of incentives, assumptions, and institutional structures that made it very difficult to act on what the signs revealed. That is the real lesson of the Belle Epoque, not that its people were blind, but that the conditions for clear sight were not in place.
Thank you for staying with us tonight, and thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the electric lights and the alliance systems, the cafes and the arms race, the art that survived and the world that did not.
The Belle Epoque reminds us that beauty and catastrophe are not opposites. They can occupy the same moment, the same city, and the same civilization, and the one does not protect against the other.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.